I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Today we have Professors Chris Ray and Bruce Rusk. They're both at the University of British Columbia. They just published another volume of Zhang Yingyun's book. The English title is More Swindles from the Late Ming, Sex, Scams, and Sorcery. The book is printed by Columbia University Press, available wherever good books are sold. I'll put a link in the podcast webpage where you can buy it. ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. If you go there and click on this particular episode, you should find a link in that. Thank y'all for coming on the show.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Why did y'all get interested in translating Zhang Yingyu's work?
I initially got interested in part because I'm interested in the whole question of how people trust and also how people deceive in pre-modern China. And I used a few of the stories in the class. I translated them and gave them to students, and they responded well. They liked these stories of con artists, of swindles at the kind of lowest levels of Ming society in some cases. And then Chris and I were kind of talking about that and came up with the idea of translating initially about half the book for the first volume, which came out in 2017. And we then decided that it would be a good idea to do the rest.
I got interested in the Book of Swindles, and I learned about it from Bruce. I was just doing my own work, and then this charismatic guy came along. He's like, hey, you should work on this project. It's going to be really easy. And several years later, I wake up and all this time has gone by. No, I had
the check is in the mail. It's another one of those things.
Yeah, exactly. Still waiting. No, I had done one project about humor and laughter and the cultural history of humor in early 20th century China, and noticed that there were a lot of books about what a fraud-ridden place Shanghai is. There's clearly like a really strong regional stereotype about Shanghainese. And there was so much immigration to that city in the early 20th century, and even 19th century people fleeing the Taiping Rebellion and so forth, that I was curious of how that developed. A lot of those stories were told for laughs or told for entertainment. And so when Bruce mentioned that there was this Ming dynasty work called the Book of Swindles, I thought I really need to read this. I wonder, how do they think about swindles? How do they classify deception? And how are stories about deception told? And so the book had some really interesting answers, some really unexpected things in it too.
And just to give the listener a kind of brief context for the book is written in the late Ming. So when is Zhang Yingyu actually writing in terms of years?
We don't know exactly because we don't really have anything about him other than what's in the book. So there's a preface dated 1617. There are some references to dates a little before that in the book, but we don't have birth and death dates for him or anything really about anything else he might have been up to. So it's hard to say exactly, but we do have an end date. We know at least an edition came out in 1617, and he was probably writing/compiling it because probably some of the stories are gathered from other sources in the decade or two before that.
And
so you see some stories in the work that could be like gong'an xiaoshuo, they could be court case fiction. And they even, there's one story that we translated for book one where the wise magistrate Judge Bao appears. Although it's not a book from the Judge Bao canon. It seems to be riffing on that and totally inverting his image as the guy who can see through all criminal duplicity. So the book is, I think you could think of its genre of the swindle story in relation to other genres that had flourished before. Everyone's heard of the art of war, and the art of war is a lot about the practice of deception on the battlefield. And this book is much more about the practice of deception in the world of commerce. So there's a lot of stories that are really for and about the traveling businessman on the road in the late Ming.
One of the questions I wanted to ask before we kind of dove into specific stories is, what is this in terms of genre? When I was studying Chinese literature, we talked about huaben a lot. And you have huaben, which are these short stories. They're written in Ming and early Qing. And they have a kind of moral universe. Something bad always happens to people who do bad things. That doesn't seem to happen in these stories. There's no kind of like comeuppance for a lot of the people who do bad things. How do y'all position these stories in terms of genre?
It's a really good question. There's no clear genre in the sense that usually we talk about a genre as something where there's more than one work. The second work in a genre creates the genre. The first work is just a standalone. And in some ways, this is like that. It does, as Chris said, bear a lot of resemblance to the 公案小说.
公安小说, that's detective fiction, right?
Yeah.
Each individual story is a kind of case, but it's not a case that's resolved, and it's typically not a case that is solved if it is solved by the wise magistrate, but rather it's a successful swindle in many cases where the perpetrator gets away with it. So it's absolutely true that this is not a world in which the evildoers get their comeuppance unless the victim is wise to it. And that is often the lesson. So not so much a moral lesson as a practical one. If you learn the signs of a swindle and how to defend yourself against it, then maybe justice will be achieved, not by the state, not by the courts, and not by karma, but by your smarts.
You know how in Wikipedia, sometimes you'll come across something that says, this article is a stub, you can expand it. Like, there are some works in the Book of Swindles, some stories that almost seem like story stubs, which were later expanded by other writers. Or they're almost like a standalone anecdote, which is not a full flesh, like Feng Menglong style, really elaborate. Has a huge arc and a lot of detail. Some of them are more like stubs that you could just like stick into Rulin Weisher, right? It could go in the scholars there. And in fact, that's what you see a lot. I think one of the interesting things about this work is it's kind of like a node in this very wide-ranging literary genealogy, which is not linear, but you see traces of some of these scamming archetypes in earlier works, and you see episodes in later works, including really famous ones of the Chinese literary canon, that almost seem like they're taken from the Book of Swindles.
Just so the listener is clear on this, these are really dirty stories oftentimes. Like some large amounts of violence are used. I mean, these are, I'm going to read just a couple of the story titles. The worst ones are: a man rapes his daughter-in-law and then tricks her mother into sex, and a gang blinds and amputates children, leaving them maimed. This is a very different image from the one that oftentimes readers get of China as this kind of Confucian harmonious society. One of the questions I wanted to ask is how how much do you think the stories in this collection are reflecting what's really going on in society? Whereas when a lot of times we read literary works, we get an idealized version, and that's true in China and other places too. Obviously, it is a work of art, so there's going to be some creativity involved. But how much do you think this is Chinese society as it really was? Like, was southern China, and we should mention that most of these stories occur in southern China, where
Stay away from the south. Just stay out of the south. Don't go south of the Yangtze River.
Yeah, and that was another question I wanted to ask y'all is, why does Zhang pick on the South so much? Is it, I mean, he is a Southern. He's publishing in Fujian, which is in the city that's very well known for cheap production of books. They really had a kind of revolution of publishing in that city. Why does he want to pick on the South? So that's actually two questions, and y'all can take those however you want them.
Well, the first one, it's so hard to know because we don't have, say, crime statistics that would let us break down regionally the crime rates in different places. We do have, some records of court cases and that kind of thing, and crimes like this certainly did happen. So we know that it's not unrealistic to say that this kind of, in some cases, very violent and abusive activity was happening. But this is in some ways also not the most extreme form of this kind of grotesque violence. I mean, you see it in places like Shuihuzuan, in Jinpingmei, and arguably more explicitly, more directly portrayed than here. So here we get the sketch of what happened in the crimes. So we are simply told, for example, that in the example of the story of the old man who basically sexually abuses both his daughter-in-law and her mother, we're told that it happens, but there are no prurient details, unlike Jinping Mei, which revels in that description. And that simply doesn't happen here. So it's a suggestion that, yes, this is something that people would recognize as a reality of their world without needing to go into detail. And similarly with the violence, we don't get told about blood spatter or anything like that. We're simply told that someone is beaten to death a lot, but without the gory details.
Yeah, a historian could try to corroborate stuff like this. It's all told as true crime, but there's so many things that are formulaic, or there's clearly a regional stereotype going on about Southerners, or there's a professional stereotype about monks and nuns, and they are just all, it's so reductive. Like all nuns and all monks are lascivious. If you go into their temple, they're going to take advantage of you. If a Taoist comes wandering by asking for donations, he's probably a swindler. But I would say that one of the interesting works that we came across when we were researching this was a book by Mark McNichols called Forgery and Impersonation in Imperial China, Popular Deceptions in the High Qing State. This was published about 8 years ago, where he looked at actual court cases from the Qing. So this is, decades to 100 plus years later, where you do have actually very similar crimes being perpetrated in a later age. And so we, compared that just to see. And so there, for example, there was one that we translated in book 1 where everybody is about to sit and take the exams. And so it's a high pressure moment. All these families with their candidate are preparing for the exam. The kids go off to somewhere else to take the test. And in that interval, a swindler goes around to every single house and say, "Congratulations, your son passed." And then he gets a tip from each of them. He gets money. And he just goes around spreading the good news. And in Mark McNichols' work, he says that this scam was still being used in the Qing dynasty. So it seems to have been a real thing. You could probably dig out some Ming or Song antecedents too.
Any thoughts on why why he's picking on Southerners? Is that just one of those regional stereotypes?
There may be partly stereotype. I mean, he is either from Zhejiang or from Fujian. So it's, as you said, published in Jianyang in Fujian, which was a major publishing center. The publisher that published it, at least one early edition, was also a publisher of Gong'an Xiaoshuo and the so-called daily use encyclopedias. So for a very popular audience, probably printed in large numbers, available relatively cheaply. The South was an area of bustling commerce, and that's a big factor here. People are moving around, they're encountering strangers, they're doing deals with strangers, and that creates a lot of opportunities for this kind of swindle. People can take advantage of the lack of trust in that world.
There's a lot of silver really sloshing around empire down there too, right?
Absolutely. So there's money. People have to find ways to move money safely, and goods that are easily commoditized. So in the north, movement was more by land and slower and probably just less commercialized. And so you're more likely to know the people you're dealing with. And so a lot of the stories here are based on how to deal with strangers and how to know when to trust them.
Including on water. So, Bruce mentioned that there's a lot of river commerce. And we did map, like there are a lot of these stories that say, so-and-so was from here. He was like from Nanjing and they traveled down to Guangdong. He also went to, Sichuan or something like that. People will be traveling thousands of miles in these stories. And it's somewhere on that road that they encounter the swindler. Sometimes that person poses as being from their hometown. But the longer title of the book is the Jianghu Lilan Du Pian Xin Shu. So it's about the Jianghu, this like rivers and lakes imaginary of river commerce. And, people think of it nowadays in relation to martial arts fiction and maybe triad stories as well, this kind of underworld imaginary. But in some cases, for the Ming, it was literally on water as well. So there's a whole section about swindles on boats, and there's also, waterborne stories in a lot of the other sections as well.
One of the stories, and I was trying to look at my notes, and I couldn't figure out which one, but it's basically, don't marry outside of your home area because you're, like the amount of trust you need to have to pull off a good marriage is something where you really need to know the people involved. And the story revolves around an older man who takes a concubine who's already married, and they just have a plot to essentially scam him out of that money that he pays. And then the woman who is involved after essentially performing some sexual services for him leaves and goes away, and they hide her. At the end of the story it says, don't marry outside your home province, or don't marry outside your home, like is something like that.
Yes, in Canada we follow that rule as well. Only marry within province. That one's a new concubine is kidnapped from a boat at night.
Yeah.
I believe that the guy who's fleeced, he has just been appointed as an official. And so he
Right.
is traveling to take up his post. And there's this interval. He's like, I think I'll just pick up a wife on the way, or a concubine on the way, as one does. And but he has a deadline. Like, he can't stick around.
Mhm.
And it's almost like the swindlers know this, that
Mhm.
he can't stay around to make trouble for them. But yes, the sex and the swindling appears partly, it's executed partly on a boat. And
Mhm.
I think the other boat has like a flag to show when she should escape to the other boat.
Yeah. I wanted to ask about that kind of the sort of passages at the end of, I think every story has a passage at the end where you kind of have the historian saying, this is how you get out of this swindle. And that to me evoked Sima Qian, who, when writing the Shiji, the records of the grand historian, he always has sort of a moral lesson, or he often has a moral lesson right there at the end of each chapter. How seriously do y'all take these comments at the end? Because sometimes he seemed to be saying, this is how you get out of the swindle, but it really felt more of like that was an excuse to talk about something really prurient. I got the feeling that he's very aware of the market, and as all of the folks writing in the Jianyang sort of literary arena are very much market oriented, and he was just kind of giving himself moral cover to talk about stuff that he knew would sell well because it was nasty and people wanted to read it. It's not pornographic. I think y'all said that a lot of the prurient details are not there as they would be in Jinping Mei. So it doesn't come across as pornography to me, but it does seem like he knows that sex sells.
Sex sells, violence sells, but also cleverness sells. And
Mm.
he is also a connoisseur of the clever trick. So I think all of those come out. I think the book can actually be read both ways, both as a scandalizing kind of exposure of, oh, these terrible things are happening. And even for the same reader, I think it would be possible to maintain both attitudes at the same time, to treat them as very moral lessons or practical lessons, and to be stimulated by the violence, the cleverness, the sex, all at the same time. And I don't think those were necessarily in conflict, but there had to be a veneer of morality and also of scholarly and historical precedent. So many of these notes at the end of the stories cite classical texts, histories, and especially the Book of Changes as a source of wisdom. Sometimes parts of the four books, the Analects and Mencius, as a way of framing these as something like history, like Sima Qian did, but probably a lot of readers didn't necessarily skip over those bits, but that wasn't why they read it.
Yeah, and our lawyers have told us, do not read this book to learn how to swindle. We do not advocate that. But there's like the fake silver section, type 14. One of the stories we translated for volume 2 called Passing Whitewashed Ingots in Maozhou. It tells a very short story about a guy went to market, somebody, showed him silver that looked like it was genuine. Turned out that most of it was fake. He discovers that he's been passed bad currency, but then he makes the moral decision not to then turn around and fleece somebody else. He just says, I'll take the loss. It was my fault. And then there's this extremely long author comment where he essentially just cribs a whole pamphlet or guide for how to distinguish different grades of silver and even how to make alloys and different types of fake silver. So you could essentially use it as a cookbook to make your own dubious adulterated silver. You can try it on your own at home if you want. I don't know if the recipe is complete in every case. We haven't tried it ourselves. But yeah, it's essentially like he says, here's how people make fake silver, and here's how you detect it.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that passage because it seems like he says it's just crimped from another book and he abridged it. How much of this book is coming from other sources? I think with the story of a marriage scam of passion comes to light because of a frog. That story, y'all mentioned that there have been versions of that plot circulating since the Song dynasty. Is Zhang recycling things? They would have different ideas of authorship, and kind of originality is not a thing in China at that particular point.
That one's a really interesting case. A marriage scam of passion comes to light because of a frog. That's in the marriage section. This is one where the woman is a virtuous one, and her husband and a neighbor go on a very long business trip together, and he dies. The family doesn't know how he died, but it turns out it's because the neighbor murdered him. And then the neighbor comes back, and after a lot of shows of being a moral person and doing everything by the book and expressing the proper remorse about this terrible calamity, he finds a way to marry the woman that he's been coveting for so long. So he marries his neighbor's wife. They have children. They have a long, 20-year marriage before this natural occurrence, like there's a flood and a frog comes out and hops around. He keeps pushing it back into the water, and it stirs his memory of how he had murdered his friend by drowning him, drowning his neighbor in the river. So he confesses, and then the woman essentially disowns him on the spot, says, I want a divorce, I'm going to report you. The man is put to death. But she even takes the extra step of disowning the sons that she's had with his second husband. And so it turns into this story of womanly virtue that is very, very moralizing. And there are versions that appear from the Song Dynasty. You have stage versions. You have other versions in, I think, Huanxi Yuanjia or Antagonists in Love, another late Ming collection from a couple decades later. And so this was, it's formulaic in some ways. I think it's one of the longest stories in this particular collection, but it's one where the story archetype was clearly quite popular and had a readership, and also had authors interested in adding their own touches to this. So that one is not followed by a comment in this case, but it seems like one of many stories in the collection that the author got from somewhere else and then did his own version of. But it was one that was being recycled by many authors.
And for a lot of the others that feel like they were drawn from another source, we probably just don't have those anymore. They may have circulated in manuscript, but there are a few, for example, clusters where there are similarities between a group of stories.
Like just a phrase or two sometimes,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, like in some cases in the end of the story, there's a kind of moral and it's phrased in the same way across several of them. And it really feels like it's drawing from something else, but we just don't have that.
I wanted to ask about questions of consent. When I was reading some of these stories, I was thinking definitely about how much is consent a question in terms of these stories. In one of the stories, a man, I think we mentioned this before, a man rapes his daughter-in-law and then tricks the mother into having sex. You have a man who is in a household where the wife is fairly strict. He's not been able to try and make a pass at his daughter-in-law. The wife one day just goes out, I think, drinking with a friend, and the husband makes a pass at his son's wife, his daughter-in-law, and she says no. He still insists, and then after whatever happens, she runs off to her mother, and the wife comes back, and the husband ask her to help out, which is, it seems strange that she agreed to help deal with the situation because she's so strict beforehand. But she comes up with a plan, which seemed really devilish to me.
She like
Yeah.
protects her rapist husband.
Yeah, she says, I'll save your hide this once. Get 4 ounces of silver, smelt them into 2 ingots, then hide yourself in the outer guest room under the big tub. When the mother shows up, I'll have her take a bath in the guest room. When you hear her finish, come out from underneath the tub and place 2 ingots in her hand. She's sure to hold on to them, and then she won't resist you. Rape her once, and then scram, and the whole matter will be put to rest. That's her solution, and that's exactly what happens when the rape actually occurs. She comes out of the tub. He puts the silver ingots in her hands and then begins to assault her. It seems like the text tells us that the mother was thinking both about the money and about how she probably wouldn't be able to get out of it anyways. It seems to suggest that she sort of consents to it. I was wondering, how much should we be thinking about consent in these situations? Obviously, when thinking about these things in modern terms, we have to be thinking about that question. But how much of that is not even a question for Zhang himself?
It's tricky because this book is largely about theories of mind, about thinking about what's going on in other people's heads and what they're thinking, feeling, assuming, perceiving. And in that case, part of what I think the swindle, if we can call it a swindle, is playing with is the expectation of someone's perception. That if the mother is seen holding money naked, engaged in a sexual act with the husband, then she will have no basis for kind of defending herself.
She has no plausible deniability anymore. She's been put in this situation where she couldn't possibly defend herself in court.
In the legal code, there is to some extent, a theory of consent. Resistance does matter, for example, but a lot of the sexual crimes or fornication, as it was defined legally, are partly about hierarchy and the family relationship among people more than they are about people's willingness or unwillingness. And so, in that sense, consent is not central.
This is where the patriarchy comes in.
Yeah.
You could say.
Yeah.
Is what you're saying that raping a widow would be less problematic in a legal context than raping a married woman? Is that right? Because you're taking the property of a man, essentially.
Not necessarily. A widow, at least nominally, in a sense, remained married.
That's right.
If she maintained her chastity, and so in that sense, it could be just as heinous a crime because the widow still had this bond. What may be more difficult was that a woman could not testify, for example, or bring a charge on her own behalf. And so it would have to be, for example, her son who did that.
Ranking male member, like uncle or something.
Yeah. So in that case, women such as widows are in tenuous positions. Even if they're supposed to be morally defended by the state and by morality, they're not given grounds for doing that on their own.
And we have one part of the introduction to volume 2 called Family Relations, Familial Perversions, where we talk about some of the standards and like what would be a reasonable expectation for like how a widow would behave. And so we talk a lot about the economics where women were often in a severely disadvantaged position, including within their in-laws' houses. And so if their main means of support and connection to the family, the husband, dies, and if they have a child, especially a son, they may be in a slightly better negotiating position. But a lot of it does come down to economics, and the decisions that widows have to make are partly about keeping themselves from poverty. And so that comes up in big ways and small in these different stories, including the story about that you just mentioned. Well, that's not a widow story, but the one about the frog, for example, that's a lot about how a widow should behave. And, and it really, you do have to kind of parse what are the different levels of what's going on here. because in that case, she does follow the demand of her father-in-law, the father of her dead husband, to remarry, where she didn't want to remarry. She wanted to remain a chaste widow, but he forces her to for strategic reasons and for his own self-interest. And then she comes to grief because of that.
In the introduction, y'all talk about this commoditization of sex. There doesn't seem to be any difference between oftentimes the way money is and money and sexual capital kind of are interchangeable. I'm thinking specifically of this story about the broker fleeced after an affair with a broker's daughter. This family literally commoditizes their daughter, they scam this man into having a sexual relationship with her, and then it comes to light. If I remember correctly, a judge adjudicates the case and says, you now have to marry this woman to the broker. And he has to sell her almost immediately. So there's this kind of back and forth, but where women become just quite literally a commodity in the story. That was one of the things that I thought was really fascinating, thinking about economics in the late Ming and how that's portrayed. And there's really no difference in the way that Zhang portrays women and money oftentimes.
And that's one of the stories where the ironic contrast between state or Confucian morality and the realities of social life come out most clearly, because yes, the judge says
it's the Confucian prescription, right?
Yes. Yes, you have to have this formalized as a marriage, which happens, but the reality is that leaves the merchant who spent all his money in order to make this happen with nothing else, and he can't even get back home. And the only resource that he has to work with
The only capital.
the only piece of the capital is converted by this act, even though it was supposed to be a moral act by the judge. He, in effect, converted his monetary capital into the form of a wife, and that is all that he's left with. So he ends up selling her, and there's clearly a market for that, and it's not an issue. And it's only because the previous case was brought to court that, for other reasons, because he lost his money, that this draws the attention of the state. And normally, under the table, all of this is happening. And so in that sense, it's unwise to bring anything to the state's attention if you can possibly avoid it. And that's one of the recurring lessons of the book.
And that example you gave is from the illicit passion section of the book. And a lot of the morals, essentially, if you read them across the grain, is don't do illicit passion. Don't follow that because it's inherently bad. Don't do it because it's bad for your pocketbook. Like it's bad. Like you will lose money on the deal if you give in to lust at that moment. I think that's similar to the one you were talking about earlier, the story on boats of the man on his way to take up a post, and he can't keep it in his pants. He buys a new concubine, and it was a bad idea. He should have just continued on his way, saved his money.
We've talked a lot about sex, but there's more to this collection than sex. There's a story called Robbed by Crooks in Broad Daylight While Taking a Dump, which just seems that the moral of the story is don't leave hold on to your money when you're taking a dump while traveling, because some people come by while he's taking a dump and just grab his stuff. There are so many different lessons that Zhang is hitting on. Did y'all have any particular stories that were your favorite that we haven't talked about?
I mentioned one thing about the violence. One of the points that we made in our introduction to the first volume is that there's a pretty clear distinction. Like if you were to do comparative swindling between, say, the US and Ming China, that, we looked at books about the early 20th century American con man, which was a very developed culture, and they had this certain playbook that they worked by, but they avoided violence. Whereas the gun, the crooks in this collection, sometimes use violence, sometimes they use guile. They use whatever is right for the situation for them. The taking a dump story, there's not really any swindle or deception that happens, and it's just pure violence there. So we may feel a little deceived if we're looking for a swindle in some of these stories and it doesn't really show up. Sometimes it's just strong-arming people.
Yeah, there's no clear line between what we might think of as a con and what we might think of as simply a violent crime. What we do learn is that there is this class of people who are professional swindlers, or professional crooks, as we translate the term 棍的光棍, and they can make a living at this. One of my favorite stories, there's a character who's described as a thug, Diao Min, and he is a thug, but he pulls off a clever swindle. And he simply notices that, or he's being insulted by a merchant on a boat who he's traveling with, who has heard about the thug. There's apparently all kinds of stories about the predations of this individual, and he secretly is listening in on the conversation without anyone realizing that he's the thug. And he takes his seal and stamps the quilt, the bedroll of the person who's gossiping about him. Then, as they're getting off the boat, he seizes the bedroll and holds on to, walks into the court, the yamen, with it, basically claiming, "This is mine." And he proves that it's his because it matches his seal. So this idea that the most brazen criminals could get away with it, sometimes with violence, but sometimes with pure cleverness. And in this case, doing it not only out in the open, but right in the yamen, winning this court case on the spot, tells us that there wasn't a lot of confidence in anyone providing justice other than your own smarts.
And in some cases, you have really interesting stories. In other cases, it's maybe the author's comment that is more interesting. The story itself may be a bit more pedestrian, but the author's comment will either use clear logic or maybe tortuous logic to try to separate the good from the bad. And so I think that is one of the main interests of this collection, is that you do have multiple voices being represented. Some of the more prurient stories, he will say he heard from a friend, right? That this is like hearsay or gossip. But yeah, I think that there's one story in book 1 that is kind of a warning for noble-born people to not sleep around because they will lose their seed, like their family line will be displaced. And then there's an author comment that's like 3 or 4 times as long as the story. It includes 3 other stories nested within that comment, essentially making the same argument. Don't sleep around because you are being duped. You are being tricked, and like of your asset, which is like your bloodline. And so these lower born people will steal it away from you. And that's just not a scenario that would occur to a lot of us, maybe in the modern world nowadays, because the rich young man does get to sleep around, but he thinks he's gaining in the short run, but he's losing in the long run. And somebody else bears the children who end up going on to become high officials. So this is one example of how there's unexpected things, and Zhang Yu sometimes does turn somersaults in trying to explain them. Other times he just is essentially like compiling or collating a bunch of stories on one theme, where you may even get further and further from the idea of deception and just more towards like, how do you protect your property? How do you protect your assets as somebody who has assets?
If I remember correctly, at least in Jingping Mei, the word capital in Jingping Mei and in other late Ming texts is sometimes used to describe semen. Is that right?
I think there's sometimes a parallel between the flow of silver and the flow of male essence. Speaking of flow, this is an interesting book because we don't know everything about its textual history. There are a few Ming Dynasty copies. It was reprinted in the 20th century. There's a bit of a gap in between of several hundred years where we don't know if it had a lot of readers or other editions or copies. It did circulate in Japan, so it did make it overseas. And I think it's really interesting to look at this collection in relation to collections of swindle stories that you find in contemporary China. There's lots, like dozens and dozens, which are essentially pianjing. They're also classics or books of swindles. for the present day and in other parts of the world. So you find them in the UK or, in 18th century England. You find them in Spain. You find them in the United States. And when you look at these other collections, like in the early 20th century US, there are a lot of crooks playbooks being shared as true crime stories, including by people who identify as former criminals who are now reformed. And they've turned from being con artists to being literary men of letters. And they're now telling their stories about how they used to live. And so it raises questions about at what times and places do you have these people, this like surge of cultural interest in stories about deception. And I think that may be relevant to our current day. I think there's a lot of interest in swindles and power. But in the book of Swindles, most of the swindles are very, very regional or local. Their impact is local. I think there's only one where it really threatens the entire empire. So for Zhang Yu's world, it seems like his interest is really this kind of atomized existence for the individual business person, how it might affect them and their family. And you would have to think about, how it affects society from a broader perspective. But he doesn't always make that link for us. That's something that's more implicit in the collection.
Is there still much of a readership for this book in China today?
Absolutely. So it was first reprinted, as far as we can tell, in China as a sort of scholarly edition in the late 1980s. But then in the 1990s, popular editions started to appear that were geared as both interesting stories from pre-modern China, but also as guides to what you might encounter in this, in some ways, quite similar economic environment. And there's even an edition in which each of the Ming stories is paired with a contemporary story. So there might be a story of one of these swindles in the Ming, and then something about, this happened on the Shenzhen stock market where somebody pumped up a stock and tricked people into losing millions of RMB. So absolutely, there's a parallel. It probably inspired the titles and contents of many of these contemporary books. We're still waiting for the movie adaptation, but I'm sure it or the video game will be out soon.
But we are editing a Chinese language edition of this that has all our annotations and punctuations and comments on this text that we're doing for a publisher in Taiwan. So we'll see. We'll see if it continues to resonate. But yeah, and it's a work that's in classical Chinese. So you also have editions that translate it into modern Baihua Chinese as well.
More or less successfully.
More or less successfully. It's not all reliable, but the version we're doing in Taiwan, there's no modern translation. We're going to see if people can still read classical Chinese.
When I was taught classical, one of the things that my teachers suggested is books that are lower socially tend to be written in a lower register, kind of something in between Wen, the classical Chinese, and modern Baihua. Is it real, like full on classical, or is it that kind of mid tier register that was more common for lower stories?
It's definitely that mid-tier. There is a relatively simplified vocabulary. The syntax isn't terribly dense. There's a little bit more classical allusion, for example, in some of the author's notes, but the stories themselves are classical syntax, but pretty easy to read. There are occasional bits of vocabulary that are dialectal, are typically Fujian dialect that would have been spoken in Jianyang in the region where it was published. But for the most part, it's classical, but some of the dialogue too uses, for example, the second person pronoun ni, which was the vernacular rather than one of the truly classical forms.
And the language is repetitive in some ways if you read through it. But if you want to get a really good sense of the contrast in these different registers you're talking about, try reading one of the stories and then read the original of the preface that was written by somebody else. And it is so highly elusive. It's like, and so that is our most footnoted story, so to speak, where he's just left and right drawing allusions to other places.
So some of these stories might be a good place if you wanted to work on your classical Chinese, not the preface, but the stories are fairly simple and easy to read.
Absolutely.
I think that's a good place to wrap it up. Bruce, Chris, thank you all for coming on. Again, one last time, the book is called More Swindles from the Late Ming, Sex, Scams, and Sorcery. It's by Zhang Yingyu and translated by Bruce Rusk, Christopher Ray. Thanks to Columbia University Press for connecting us. Thank you all so much for being on the podcast.
Thanks so much, Lee.
I'm Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.